there, and welcome to our webinar today, all about the end of the EU transition period and how it impacts VAT MOSS. My name is Alex Wyatt from simplyvat.com. We are international VAT experts specializing in online sellers trading cross-border and their compliance. If you want to reach out to our team, we have left some links below in the description on how to contact us. Today, I am joined by our VAT researcher, Louise. If you have questions for Louise, please pop them in the chat box just to the right of the video, and we'll be able to pop them up after the presentation has completed, and she can answer them. So I'm going to hand over to Louise and add her slides to the screen here. So Louise, if you want to take it away.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you online for this webinar. So as Alex mentioned, my name is Louise and I'm the VAT researcher at simplyvat.com. And today the topic will be the mini one-stop shop and the impact of Brexit on reporting your digital supplies in the EU. So let's just crack on with this. So let's just start by giving you an overview of what is the mini one-stop shop actually. Some of you, I'm aware, may have never heard of it. So the mini one-stop shop, which we usually refer to as the MOSS, is a portal which is available in every single EU member state, so EU country. And it's basically a single window which was created to simplify reporting of VAT for taxable people, so for taxable persons or businesses. And basically, this reporting method allows businesses to report their VAT due on TBE services or digital services in a single place instead of registering in every single EU country where they should be reporting VAT. So the MOSS is only for B2C supplies, not for B2B supply. We will come back to B2B supplies later on when we cover more about digital services. So as I've just said, basically this portal allows you to register in a single country instead of having to register in every single EU country where you supply digital services. It's an optional scheme, so you don't have to join it if you don't want to, but you can if it makes sense for you as a business. However, what you need to know is that once you choose to opt in for the MOSS in a country, you have to use it to report your VAT in every single other EU country where you supply services. So it's not optional on an individual country basis. So it means that basically, once you register on it, you have to use it to report the VAT in every member state where you have customers. Let's just start by giving a bit of an overview of what we consider digital services. So digital services range from radio, television and broadcasting services, which are usually referred to as TBE services. So these range from the supply of audio and audiovisual content for simultaneous listening, live streaming through the internet, for example, but also broadcasting by a radio or television. Digital services also include what we call telecommunication services. And these are typically the services such as telephone, so mobile phone services, telephone services, access to the internet. And lastly, the last category of digital services are electronically supplied services. So these are any supply of images, of photos, of ebooks, of PDF files, but also music streaming, film streaming, gaming, online gambling, online magazines, web hosting services, but also software and software maintenance. So as you can see, digital services range from a really wide range of supplies. Okay, let's have a look at the background of MOSS. Why was this portal created in the first place? So MOSS has been in place since the 1st of January 2015 across the EU. So it's an EU-wide portal, and it's also been, of course, available in the UK as well. So it's a simplification portal for e-commerce businesses, and it was created to offer a simplified measure following the change of VAT place of supply rules in the EU for digital supplies. We're going to come back to this in a little bit. But basically, with the creation of MOSS, in the EU, it was decided that any digital supply should be taxed where the customer is based. That's really important. So try to remember this. Digital supplies need to be charged with VAT where your customers are located instead of where you are located as a supplier. That's really important notion to remember. So keep that in mind. So with this new rule, it meant that businesses suddenly had to VAT register everywhere where their customers were located, which was quite a burden in terms of admin and costs, in terms of registering everywhere. As you can imagine, for smaller businesses, that was quite a big change. So that is why the EU came up with this portal to allow businesses to report the VAT due everywhere in the EU in a single place, instead of having to register everywhere where their customers are located. An additional simplification was implemented in January 2019, and this was is a derogation for really small businesses, for SMEs, under which, if your turnover does not exceed 10,000 euros, the place of supply of your digital services can remain where you are based as a supplier. So it means that as a really small business, if you supply, for example, digital patterns, knitting patterns, sewing patterns, and your cross-border turnover is below 10,000 euros, you don't have to charge VAT where your customers are located. And instead, you can simply treat your supplies as a domestic supply. So it's a simplification for really small businesses. And again, it's going to be important to remember for later on. Another thing to remember as well is that the MOSS returns, these are additional returns in addition to your existing domestic VAT return. You can only report cross-border supplies on the MOSS. So it means that as a business, if you are based, for example, in France and you supply digital patterns everywhere in the EU, the supplies you make in France, within France, will have to be reported on your domestic French VAT return instead of the MOSS. So the MOSS is only for cross-border supplies. So e-services, we've just covered this a little bit, but as I said, these are typically electronic supplied delivered over the internet or an electric network, and the nature of which renders their supply essentially automated, and they involve minimal human intervention. So it's basically impossible to ensure without information technology. So typically software, online teaching, music streaming, or digital patterns are covered under the MOSS. So how does it actually work? So as a business, you can register on the MOSS in a single EU member state. We call it the member state of identification. This is the country where you will identify for the MOSS. Once you are identified on the MOSS, you have to file a single quarterly MOSS return where you will break down all your supplies that you have been carrying out in other countries in the EU. So basically, typically you will have the amounts, the supplies you've made in Spain, in Belgium, everywhere, with the VAT amount that you owe. The deadline is typically the 20th day of the following quarter. So, for example, after your first quarter, you will wait the 20th day of the following month to file your MOSS return. Once you have filed your single MOSS return, and you have paid your single VAT amount to your member state of identification, so where you are registered for MOSS, your member state of identification, which is the tax authorities where you are registered, will distribute the VAT amounts accordingly to every single member state of consumption. So the member states of consumption are typically the member states where your consumers are based. So again, let's, for example, say that I am a French business, I am established in France, I will register on the MOSS in France, and every quarter I will submit my data to the French tax authorities for MOSS. And then the MOSS team in France will redistribute the VAT amount to all the other countries where my consumers are based. So that's no longer my responsibility. Once you have submitted your MOSS return, you will receive a unique reference number for the return. And this is a number you can use for any communication that you might have with the tax authorities about your MOSS return. For example, if you need to make a correction or any sort of communication needed. And of course, a single VAT payment is made. What's really important to remember is that once you join the MOSS, you have to comply with the local VAT rate in every single member state where you supply your goods, your digital goods. So again, we've covered what digital supplies are. They range from ebooks, they range from online gaming, publications, broadcasting. These can have different VAT rates in every single member state. So one thing to remember is that if you are using the MOSS, you need to keep an eye on the VAT rates applicable for all these supplies, and you have to comply with these VAT rates. So that can be one challenge. And it means that perhaps your pricing might be affected. So you will need to reflect that in your pricing. The place of supply on MOSS, a really important concept. I've just said, but I'm going to repeat that because again, that's quite important. For MOSS, for digital supplies, the place of supply is always where your consumers are located. And this is where the VAT is due. The threshold, which is 10,000 euros, is a simplification threshold. As soon as you breach this cross-border threshold on your digital supplies, in the current or preceding calendar year, you have to charge VAT where your customers are located. Under this threshold, you're considered as a SME and you can simply treat your supplies as domestic supplies. So it means that basically you will keep charging the VAT rates applicable in your country of establishment. Yes, so again, MOSS is not relevant for domestic supplies. You cannot report your domestic supplies within MOSS. It's only for cross-border supplies. Again, quite important to remember for later on. So we're going to be covering the two different schemes which currently exist within the MOSS portal. So the first one is called the Union Scheme. So of course, every tax office has their own MOSS portal. So typically the French tax authorities will have their MOSS portal, the UK has had their own MOSS portal, etc. There are two different schemes though. The Union Scheme, that we're going to start by this one. So the Union Scheme is the MOSS scheme which is available for EU established businesses. When you are established in the EU and you want to use the MOSS, your member state of identification will have to be the member state where you are established, so where your head office is, or where you have a fixed establishment, for example. If you have several fixed establishments, then on the MOSS you can choose where you want to register. Your member state of consumption cannot be the member state of establishment. So that means that, again, domestic supplies cannot go on the MOSS. If you have consumers of your digital supplies within the country where you are established, these will go on your domestic VAT return, not on the MOSS. So remember, MOSS is only for cross-border. And you can actually be VAT registered for other VAT purposes in other member states and still use the Union US for your digital supplies. So remember, this is an additional return. So it's in addition to the other reporting obligations that you may have in other member states. For example, you may need a VAT registration in Spain, for example, because you are holding stock. So you will still need to file your VAT return in Spain. However, if you are supplying digital supplies to Spain from France or from the UK, then you can do that on the MOSS. If you look at on this screen on the right, you'll see an overview of what a MOSS report looks like. So typically, this is a receipt of a VAT MOSS return in the UK. So you can see typically how this is broken down, basically per country of consumption. Well, this is in Ireland, actually. So in this case, the supplier has been supplying from Ireland to EU consumers, and you can see the breakdown of all the supplies made from Ireland to Czech Republic, Denmark, France. From that point, the Irish tax authorities would have sent these amounts, these VAT payable amounts, they would have distributed those to every single member state automatically without the involvement of the seller. Moving on to the non-union scheme. The non-union scheme is also one of the current MOSS scheme, and this one is available for non-EU businesses. So it will be interesting for UK traders in the future, as we'll see later on. But as a non-EU business, so if you are established outside of the European Union, you can still use MOSS to report your the VAT due on your digital supplies. In that case, you can choose where you want to register, actually, because you're not based in the EU. So you have the choice of where you want to identify for MOSS. It could make sense to look at languages, for example. So if you are based in the US or in the UK, then perhaps picking Ireland might make sense for because the MOSS will be in English, obviously, whereas in other countries it might be in the local language. That's something to think about as well. For the non-union MOSS, the member state of identification can also be the member state of consumption. What does it mean? It means that even though you are identified in a country for MOSS, your supplies within this country can go on your MOSS because you're not based in the EU, so you don't have a domestic VAT return, whereas an EU-based business would have a domestic VAT return. So this is a difference with the union MOSS. You can report all your digital supplies on the non-union scheme. Okay, let's have a look at B2B supplies of digital services. So really important to remember, MOSS is only for B2C supplies. So any B2B supplies of digital services or TBE services cannot go on the MOSS. Instead, there are different rules for cross-border B2B supplies within the EU. So, these are outside of the scope of MOSS, and instead, when you supply a B2B, when you make a B2B supply of digital services to another, obviously to another EU-based business, the EU customer will be responsible for accounting for any VAT due to the tax office in their country of establishment. So this is basically a reverse charge mechanism where if you are based in the EU and you supply a software to another EU-based business, this customer will be responsible for accounting for the VAT due in their country of establishment. So you wouldn't need to register for VAT in this case. An EC sales list would need to be filed. This is to report the supply of a service. One thing to remember with B2B supplies is that if a customer does not provide you with a VAT number, you should treat this as a B2C supply, and you should check that it is located. So potentially your customer could provide you with other evidence to prove that they are a registered business, but it's your decision to treat it as a B2C supply or not. So if you don't receive a VAT number, you have the right to presume that this isn't a business, this is a B2C supply, and in such case, I can put this on my MOSS return. Let's have a quick look at B2B supplies of digital services outside of the EU. This can get quite complex, but basically, if an EU business is supplying digital services to a business based outside of the EU, this is typically outside of the scope of VAT. However, what's important to know with services and e-services is to look at where the services are effectively used and enjoyed. This is what matters, basically. So if the service and the e-service is effectively used and enjoyed within the EU, then the country where it is enjoyed can actually decide to get VAT on this. This is what we refer to as the rules of enjoyment, effective enjoyment. So where the service is effectively used and enjoyed is where VAT is typically due. We're going to have a look at a couple of examples. With B2B supplies, it's really good to really look at the exact transaction, because as you're going to see in a couple of minutes, it can get quite tricky. Actually, in such cases with services, VAT can sometimes be calculated as a portion of what is used and enjoyed within the EU. So let's have a look at two examples. For example, the first one, a US business purchases web hosting services for its international business, including its UK branch. Although the supply is received in the US, to the extent that it's used in the UK, it's subject to UK VAT. What does it mean? It means that even though the web hosting services are received in the US, they are still used by the UK branch. So in such case, we would need to really look at how much of the service is used in the UK, and how much is used in the UK would have to be charged with VAT accordingly. Of course, this is an overview. So if you do have a case applicable to your business, get in touch with us, because we would need to look at it in more details. Let's have a look at the second example. A UK business purchases downloaded information from another UK business for use both in its UK headquarters and its Canadian branch. So although the supply is received in the UK, to the extent it's used in Canada, it is outside of the scope of UK VAT. And again, in this case, UK VAT is due only to the extent of use by the UK headquarters. So again, in this scenario, because the e-service is used both in Canada and in the UK, that would only be due to the extent where it's used in the UK, so where it is effectively used and enjoyed. Moving on to Brexit, MOSS and Brexit. So with Brexit comes the end of the UK VAT MOSS. So of course, you might be aware that the end of the transition period is coming up at the end of December 2020. This means that the UK will be exiting the EU single market and customs union, but also as a consequence, the VAT MOSS scheme, because the VAT MOSS scheme is an EU-wide system. So the UK will be exiting this. The last UK MOSS return will be for Q4 2020, and the deadline to file it will be the 20th of January 2021. After the 1st of January 2021, you will still be able to access the MOSS scheme. If you are using the UK MOSS scheme currently, you'll still be able to use it and to access it in the UK for the following reasons. The first one would be if you need to make corrections to your returns up until the 20th of January 2022 until 11 p.m. The second reason would be if you need to submit any updates to your registration details, and you would have until the 31st of December 2024 to do that. The last reason would be to, if you wanted to access your previous MOSS return. So if you wanted to perhaps, just access it and review your previous MOSS return, you would still be able to do that. So any supplies made on or after the 1st of January 2021 will not be reported on the UK VAT MOSS because the UK VAT MOSS will effectively no longer exist. So how do you do moving forward? How do you go on to report your EU digital supplies as a UK seller from 1st of January 2021? Well, you have the option to switching to the non-union scheme. So as we've covered earlier, the non-union scheme is for non-EU businesses. As a UK seller, from the 1st of January 2021, you will become a non-EU seller. So the non-union scheme will be available to you. You will be able to choose a member state of consumption where you want to register. So if you supply goods into Ireland or into France, you can pick a country and choose to register for MOSS there. So maybe just pick a country that makes sense for you. Again, think about perhaps the language barrier. Once you are registered on the non-union scheme, you will have to remember to apply the VAT rates which are applicable within this country for the TB services, for the digital services, for the e-books, whatever supply you make, you have to comply with the VAT rates applicable there. You will still need to submit a single VAT return for MOSS. And the deadline to register will be the 10th day of the month following your first sale to an EU customer. So that means that if you are supplying digital supplies, such as a digital pattern, a knitting pattern, for example, a sewing pattern, if you supply this in January, on the 1st of January 2021, you will have until the 10th of February to join the non-union scheme. So there's a strict deadline to do that. Let's have a look at another example. So if you make a sale of a digital pattern to a French consumer on the 22nd of January 2021, you will have to register for the non-union MOSS by 10th of February 2021. The alternative would be to VAT register in every single member state where you make sales of digital services to private individuals. Because remember, digital supplies within the EU are due where customers are located and from the first sale. If you are not based in the EU, your first digital supply within the EU, you need to register for VAT, you need to charge VAT for it. So it's really important to bear that in mind. Let's have a look at the mirroring option. So how do you report your GB digital supplies if you are an EU-based seller? So overseas traders, including EU sellers, supplying digital services to GB consumers on and after the 1st of January 2021 will no longer be able to report these supplies on the VAT MOSS in the UK. Instead, overseas businesses, including EU businesses, continuing to sell online services in the UK will need to register for VAT in the UK from the first sale to report and pay the VAT due on these B2C digital supplies. So the HMRC has been quite clear that that will be due on the first pound of digital supply you make in the UK, and actually you just need to register for VAT in the UK if you're not already, because there has been no information on an equivalent to the VAT MOSS in the UK so far. Maybe in the future they might do that. We don't know. What we know is that it will be the end of the UK VAT MOSS. Okay, so we've covered MOSS for digital supplies. You may have heard that there are some changes, some tremendous changes coming up in the EU for e-commerce. So remember, MOSS came into place in 2015 as a simplification for e-commerce businesses supplying online services. There are further changes coming across the EU in July 2021. So from the 1st of July 2021, the MOSS scheme, as we know it, will be extended into a one-stop shop. So the mini one-stop shop will be extended into a one-stop shop. With this extension, there will be a single quarterly VAT return simplification along with the abolition of the current distance selling rules as we know them. So you may know, this isn't necessarily the topic of this webinar. So if you have further questions on this, please feel free to get in touch with us. We'll be happy to help. But you may be aware that the distance selling regime in the EU is quite specific. You need to comply with distance selling thresholds and monitor these thresholds in every single member state. This will be abolished from July 2021. And instead, there will be a single, the opportunity to submit a single VAT return to report the VAT on your distance sales. This is part of the EU digital single market strategy. Of course, it will be an optional scheme. The MOSS is already optional. The non-union scheme is optional. All these schemes are optional. So this simplification will also be optional if it doesn't make sense for your business to use them. Along with these changes, there will also be new import simplifications. So that could be interesting for you as a UK seller. This will be interesting for you because there will be import simplifications along with the abolition of the low value consignment relief. So what is the low value consignment relief? This is a relief, a threshold for goods, which is currently set at 22 euros in the EU. And if you're importing goods under this value, you don't charge VAT currently in the EU, but this is being scrapped from July 2021. So with the MOSS, we've mentioned that there are different schemes. There's the union scheme and there is the non-union scheme. With the extension of MOSS into US, there will again be different schemes. So we'll be having a look at each of them now, but there'll be 3 of them. So the union scheme, the MOSS union scheme will be extended into a US union scheme. The non-union MOSS scheme will be extended into a non-union US scheme. And there will be a new scheme created, a brand new scheme created for businesses, which will be an import one-stop shop, which we refer to as IOS. So let's start with IOS, the import OS. The import OS is a special scheme for distance sales of goods imported from third countries or third territories of a value not exceeding 150 euros in consignment. So what does it mean? This is a scheme created so that if you have goods and you're importing, you're doing distance sales from outside of the EU into the EU, if you are distance selling goods in consignment up to 150 euros, you can use this scheme to report the VAT due on these supplies instead of registering everywhere in the EU. It's a scheme which is available for both EU and non-EU businesses. And you will need, if you use it, you will need to charge VAT with when your payment from your customer is accepted. So at checkout, that will be due at the checkout on your website, for example. Once you have charged VAT at the checkout, your consignments will be, so the goods which are in a consignment, in a parcel, they will be imported into the EU, and because you would have already charged VAT, these goods can go through the border VAT exempt, because you would have already collected VAT from your customers. So your goods can just clear the border, clear customs without paying any import VAT. The alternative, if you cannot or if you don't want to use this scheme, because again, remember, it's optional. So if you cannot use it, there will be further import simplifications available by member states. So these simplifications will typically be a reduced data custom declaration. Moving on to the Union US. So the Union US, again, this is the extension to the Union MOSS. The Union US will be available from the 1st of July 2021 to report VAT due on intra-EU distance sales. So the import US is for imported distance sales of goods imported. The Union US is for intra-EU distance sales. So intra-EU sales of goods which are already located in the EU at the point of sale. From 2021, this scheme will be extended to cover all types of B2C services, so no longer just e-services, all types of services, no longer online, just any services to consumers, as well as intra-EU cross-border distant sales of goods, and certain domestic supplies facilitated by marketplaces. Currently, the MOSS, as we've just said, is only for e-services. So this is the scope of the MOSS will be extended to quite an extent. Businesses will be able to join the scheme with their local tax office. So again, this is the same logic as the MOSS. If you're based in the EU, you will need to register with the tax office of the country where you're based. So if you're based in Spain, you will need to use the OSS scheme from Spain. And the extension of this scheme into an OSS goes hand in hand with the end of the current distance sales regime, which is in place in the EU. So you may be familiar with the distance selling thresholds. Perhaps you're a customer of ours, or perhaps you are managing your VAT in-house. You may know that if you're doing distance sales, you have to monitor your turnover in every single member state where you sell goods, because once you reach a threshold in a certain country, you have to register for VAT, and you have to start complying with the VAT rules in this member state. So this will completely change with the OSS, and instead the different thresholds that we know in every single member state, these will be scrapped and replaced by a single EU-wide threshold of 10,000 euros. The non-union OSS. This is the last scheme which will come into place from July 2021. So the non-union OSS will be available for businesses not established in the EU and with no EU fixed establishment. So this scheme will be covering all types of B2C services. So no longer just online services, but any types of services that you would provide to consumers in the EU. So this will be interesting for UK businesses as well, because if you provide any consulting or any type of services, advice or business advice or anything to a consumer, then you will be able to report the VAT due on the service you supply, whether it's as an architect or anything. You will be able to report this on the OSS, sorry. And again, because this is for non-EU businesses, you don't have an EU establishment, so you can choose the country where you want to join the scheme. So this is the end of the presentation for today. We'll be taking a few questions with Alex. So please feel free to
Hello. Okay. Thanks, Louise. Sorry, I'm hearing a bit of feedback. That was a load of information so far. So thank you so much for running through that. And you made it as simple as possible. So thank you. We've been seeing loads of questions come through. So if you have more questions and you're online, now's the time to get them answered. And I'm just going to run through a few quickly and pop them up on the screen here. And the first one, I just wanted to cover that, yes, if you've attended today's seminar, we will absolutely send you a copy of the slides for you to review. And if you want to reach out and ask further questions, again, we've put a link in the description to contact our team. So please feel free to reach out and ask your questions. You know, with the end of the EU transition period coming up, there are so many changes that are going to affect businesses, and it's best to start preparing now rather than, you know, get hit with any fines and penalties for not complying on time, when you can take those steps right now to start, you know, being compliant post-transition period. So another question that we got asked here was, can we pay with the local currency for each country? Do you want to dive a bit more into that, Louise?
Yes, so the MOSS return is actually paid in euros. Yeah, that's the guidance from the European Commission.
Do you pay it to an individual tax authority, or do you?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically, if you are based in France or in Belgium, you would register on the if I'm based in Belgium, for example, I'm going to register on the MOSS in Belgium, and I will pay everything in euros in a single currency.
Okay, perfect. Our next question here is for cross-border sales. Will we need to have a local tax representative when, I guess what they're trying to say is when actually reporting your sales, do you need a tax representative?
So that's such a good one. At the moment, with the current MOSS scheme, you don't need one. You don't need an agent to do that. If you are based outside of the EU, you use the non-union MOSS, and you don't need an intermediary to use it. With the import us in the future, which is the new scheme created by the EU, you will need an intermediary to do that. So you will be a kind of local agent. Basically, the European Commission wants to have someone local, accountable to speak to if they need to.
That makes complete sense. Yeah. So is the 10,000 euro threshold, is that per country, or is it all of the EU countries combined?
That is for all EU countries combined.
Okay, perfect. So, and is it a calendar year basis, or is it a 12-monthly rolling basis?
Yeah. It's on a calendar year, and basically it means that to monitor this threshold, you need to look at your cross-border supply, so not your domestic supply, your cross-border supplies in every single EU member state. So it's when I say every single EU member state, I mean you combine your total supplies internationally in the EU to calculate this over a calendar year. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. If you do have any questions that Louise or clarification on what on your questions that you ask, just feel free to pop them into the chat box and we can clarify if necessary.
Can I just add one thing about the previous question? So this is a really good one because per country, as you know, at the moment, you do need to look at the threshold per country, per individual country. And the big change with next year, with the new changes from July, is that instead of looking at the threshold per individual country, you will have this set unique 10,000 euro threshold, which will combine all your supplies made across the EU. So this is actually a really good question to clarify. So that's for next year. With the MOSS, it's the same. With the MOSS on digital supplies, it's already a single threshold across the EU. But when the rules change next year for distance sales, then you will also include your distance sales into that.
Okay, perfect. So if you're selling digital services right now, that you have a 10,000 euro threshold, and then going into July next year with the new EU VAT reform, we have the 10,000 euro threshold for physical products as well. So I think that's really a good one to know. Actually, I'm just going to skip down here to Pete, where this isn't the one I wanted. Sorry, it's going to be this one here. Does the 10K threshold apply to UK businesses who register for non-union MOSS when selling into the EU from January? So I guess when we're looking at this 10K threshold, the question is, does it apply to non-EU businesses, or is it just EU businesses?
It's just for EU businesses. As a non-EU business, you need to charge VAT from the first supply you make in the EU.
Perfect. Okay. I think that's a really big clarification there, because a lot of UK businesses who are maybe currently on the MOSS scheme, then that's going to change as of the 1st of January. So it's a really good question to clarify. Now, off the back of that is, what if we are registered for UK VAT and we leave the EU? Can we still register for MOSS in the UK? So
what if you're registered? So there will no longer be a MOSS in the UK, actually. So if you're currently registered for VAT for UK VAT, so it depends where you are based, I suppose, but there will no longer be from January a MOSS scheme in the UK. So if you're selling digital supplies in the UK, you will simply put them in your local VAT return. If you're that's it really. So these will go in your normal periodic quarterly UK VAT return.
Perfect. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, so we have, does this mean that I could have a MOSS registration and a local VAT registration if I'm making B2B and B2C transactions?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Because as you've rightly said, actually MOSS is only for B2C, so you can still have another VAT registration for other purposes, such as B2B supplies or holding stock, for example.
Okay, perfect. So it's really good to know, because going back to that tax representative question, maybe on the MOSS scheme, you don't necessarily need a tax representative, but if you have a local VAT registration in place and you're a non-EU business, then you may need a fiscal representative in a country if you're getting registered. So yeah, it's a really good kind of question. They all kind of tie into each other. So again, if you need clarification on a specific example, please feel free to ask away. So we have another question here talking about the margin scheme, and I think this might apply to physical products, but you kind of touched upon physical products and how that's going to change. So is there anything further on the current EU margin scheme on secondhand devices? Will that still apply to sellers in the UK and no longer after we leave the EU?
There hasn't been anything said about margin scheme on secondhand goods. So with the extension of MOSS into an OSS, this is typically for distance sales, the distance selling regime. Secondhand goods have never been part of the distance selling regime. They've never followed these rules. So these will not be eligible for the OSS. There hasn't been any communication on the change to the margin scheme. In the EU, if you're on such scheme, but typically, if the UK is exiting the EU, then you will be importing effectively into the EU. So that's when the change might come for you. But these are not covered by OSS or MOSS secondhand goods.
Perfect. Thanks for clarifying. So in the UK, will the VAT return be filed monthly?
There hasn't yeah, I haven't heard anything of that. That return are typically filed quarterly. In our experience, most of our clients are filing quarterly. You can choose the stagger on which you want to file, which can be quite convenient. So you can choose your quarters if you want to stagger them, or if you want to follow a calendar year. But there hasn't been I haven't seen anything about VAT returns being a monthly. Yeah. So
do you want to clarify how often it's filed under MOSS, OSS, and IOS?
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yes. 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 So currently the MOSS is quarterly. Across the EU, it's still quarterly in the UK. The UK VAT MOSS is filed on a quarterly basis. With the new schemes coming into place from July 2021, both the OSS scheme for EU businesses, the Union OSS, and the non-Union OSS will be filed quarterly. The scheme which will be filed on a monthly basis, though, is the import one. So it's actually quite an interesting one. This will be filed on a monthly basis. That's the exception.
Perfect. Thank you. Just to touch a bit more on the IOS scheme. So will duties need to be paid when importing under the IOS scheme?
Actually, it's a really interesting one. So if you remember from the presentation, the IOS scheme covers goods in consignment being imported with a value up to 150 euros. Why is this value? This value is the threshold for customs duties in the EU. So actually, there will not be any customs due on these goods, typically, because they are under the customs duty value. And that's why they set up the threshold at this value, basically.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we have a question here more in practice. So if an EU company provides services to a UK business, does the EU company need to register in the UK? Additionally, does the EU company have to charge VAT of the EU country? So I think this is a really good question, really in practice. If you're an EU company, what happens under the MOSS scheme if you're applying to UK private customers or even businesses?
So as an EU company, if you provide services to a UK business, this is outside of the scope of EU VAT because the service will be provided outside of the EU, so it's outside of the EU VAT. You wouldn't be able to use to report this on the MOSS anyway because it's B2B. Additionally, does the EU company have to charge VAT of the EU country? As far as I know, I think we would need to exactly look at what kind of supply, what kind of services you're making, but this sounds like it would be outside of the scope of VAT. Then we would also need to look at the UK rules. The UK might expect the UK business to report the VAT on the service they brought from abroad, for example. So we would need to look at exactly what kind of supply that makes. But from an EU point of view, this would be outside of the scope of VAT.
Perfect. And then can you just clarify if you're making, like, say, digital services sales to private individuals as an EU business, but you're selling to a private individual in the UK, since that's no longer covered under the MOSS scheme, do you need to VAT register in the UK? Is that now an obligation for sellers?
For services, I think you would still need to. I think HMRC will expect you to charge VAT on services. So no EU VAT should be due because, again, it's outside of the scope of EU VAT. But once you're selling services to a consumer, I'm pretty sure I would need to check that. But I thought you would need to because at the moment the government is putting in place policies to create a level playing field between UK-based businesses and overseas businesses. That's why there's lots of changes coming up in the UK as well. They basically want to make sure that any business charges VAT when they trade in the UK, so that there is a fair competition basically between UK businesses and overseas businesses. So I would have thought you would need to register for VAT and report this. If you have a specific case, please get in touch with us because we would be happy to look at exactly the VAT treatment. Just remember with B2B, it can also get quite complex. So we would want to look at this in detail and give you the right advice for this. But yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'm just going to jump down in some of our questions just to link it all together. So to clarify, so any B2B e-publication sales from the UK to the EU can be zero rated from January, assuming that the buyer provides a VAT number.
Yes, because yes, it would be the buyer's, the customer's responsibility to reverse charge this. So you, as a seller, as a UK-based seller, you shouldn't have to charge VAT on this. Your EU-based customer would simply reverse charge this, and you wouldn't need to register for VAT if you're supplying to a EU-based business.
Perfect. Thanks.
Which is different if it's a consumer. So again, big difference between B2B and B2C. If this was if your customer doesn't give you a VAT number, then you can assume it's a B2C supply, and then you're liable to charge VAT from the first euro.
Okay, thank you. Here's another kind of practical example. So one of our viewers has said, we have an office address in Belgium in view of the departure of the UK leaving the EU. So would they have to be, I guess, VAT MOSS registered in Belgium, for example? Let's say that there's not probably enough detail here, but say if they were a Belgian-based business, would they have to then MOSS register in Belgium in that case?
Yeah, again, there's, as Alex said, I don't really have enough information to give you something really specific. However, if you do have an office address in Belgium, so assuming you have enough presence in Belgium to be considered as a branch, as a fixed establishment, if you were supplying digital supplies from Belgium, you could use the MOSS from Belgium, or you could use in the future the US from Belgium. So you could use it from Belgium because that's where you would have a branch.
Perfect, thank you. And We have here, so what happens if you exceed the threshold within the year? If you just want to recap, what happens?
Sure. So let's start with the MOSS, for example. So imagine you're a SME, you're a small business, you will be monitoring your cross-border supplies with this 10K threshold. As soon as you breach the threshold, you will need to register for MOSS in the relevant country. So country of establishment, obviously, if you're based in the EU. You would just simply need to register, and then you would report these supplies on your MOSS return. Your VAT liability starts as soon as you breach the threshold. So that would be typically from, let's say you breach in 15th of March, for example. On the 15th of March, then you would need to register from the 15th of March, and you will need to charge VAT from the 15th of March, wherever your consumers are based. So your MOSS return will start from the 15th of March, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm just going to pop in this last question here. So what is the treatment for UK businesses supplying B2B? Would it be zero rated? I think we have kind of covered this already. Any B2B transactions after the end of the EU transition period, it would essentially be zero rated for VAT. So yeah, I think that kind of sums it up, Louise, doesn't it?
Yeah, again, we would want to see who's your customer, for example. This is, again, quite, we would want to look at who, where is your customer base, for example, because that could change the VAT treatment. If your customer is based in the EU, then you wouldn't charge VAT on this. Your customer would, your B2B customer would account for the VAT as a reverse charge, basically. So they would be accountable for the VAT in their member state of establishment.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to wrap it up here for today. We do have another Q&A session on Brexit on Thursday, December 10th at 3 p.m. So you can sign up. We'll pop a link in the description if it isn't there already. Otherwise, you can either subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure that you get access to all the videos and webinars that we run, because they're filled with loads of interesting content for your business. Or you can follow us on social media. Typically everywhere it is at Simply VAT. And if you have any questions, like I said, reach out to our team, because it's best to start preparing now for the end of the EU transition period rather than waiting until January, when we could see, an influx of registrations at the tax authorities and things might go a bit slower. So it's best to start preparing in advance if you can. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. I think that's kind of the best way to put it. But at the end of the day, we do know what's happening with VAT for the most part. So please make sure that you are getting in contact just to make sure that you're all prepared and all set for the end of the EU transition period. But otherwise, Louise and I will let you go for today, and we hope to see you on Thursday. And have a great rest of the day, everyone.